So, yeah, I worked with the Oregon Water Trust previously, right out of college. And I think when I got out of college, I thought, the river is great, we're going to save rivers. And I quickly started to learn that we need to save rivers for both their environmental reasons, but also for the people that rely on them. So, this really has been a process for me of figuring out how do we make rivers effective for both the people that live along them, the farmers, the ranchers, the people that just like the scenery, the rafters, the kayakers, but also how do we make it a place that's good for fish, for wildlife, and for all the things that rely on them. I'm a terrible biologist. I can just talk about fish, and they're just fish. I don't really get into the species all that often if I don't have to. So, oh, we didn't save it. It's not going to look quite right when I get to the next slide. Anyways, the Nature Conservancy, if you're not familiar, is one of the largest environmental nonprofits in the world, actually. We're in all 50 states and in 30 countries. We do things from land conservation to things that are like my program that are land-based, community-based, working with farmers and ranchers. We started our Colorado River program in 2008. The river, here's the basin. Does this have a pointer? There we go. So you guys probably all know the Colorado Basin. One of the things with the Nature Conservancy is we're not focused just on trying to figure out the environmental piece. It's how do we create a system that's sustainable and long-lasting. So the river is facing multiple threats and demands. How do we balance that with all of the environmental aspects? So the Nature Conservancy identified 15 priority sites throughout the basin. Most of them you can see in the upper basin. Those are all very important systems. When you get down into Colorado, there's fewer blue lines, fewer priorities, and that's because there's less water in those systems. So this is the Gila, and this is the salt. And so what should happen is the Verde should flow into the salt, which should flow into the Gila, which should flow into the Colorado, but the salt goes dry, the Gila goes dry. So it's a little bit harder to think about these as water supply in the Colorado, but ecologically they're very important systems. We also have the San Pedro system and the Gila up here in New Mexico. Okay, so we're going to talk very specifically about the Verde. This is an example of what the Nature Conservancy is doing around the Colorado Basin. So we have similar projects throughout, but we're going to just focus a lot on the Verde. So groundwater is a big water use in Arizona, so most of our drinking water comes from groundwater in the rural areas. So this whole watershed, everybody in here, you can see the gray, it's not showing up real well. But all these gray areas, this is all groundwater, drinking water. Groundwater through here, everybody has a private well. So more and more water is used for drinking, less and less water is making it to the river as surface flow. So what this does is actually create a strange alliance between the Nature Conservancy that wants surface water in the river for fish and wildlife and irrigators who want water in the river for irrigation purposes. And so that's kind of led us to a great partnership that we've been able to actually see some changes. So I don't have any studies to quote, so I'm going to tell you about a river trip that I went on. So I moved from Oregon to Arizona almost 6 years ago, and I came from a place where rivers have water because they're rivers. And they are expected to have water because they are rivers. If a river goes dry in Oregon, which happens a lot, people are concerned. You try to fix it. If you can't fix it, you understand why. And so I came to the Verde River. I saw this beautiful place. This is down near the very end of the Verde Valley. These are the White Cliffs. The Nature Conservancy actually owns this stretch of riparian area. At the time, we had just purchased this side for state parks. This river was beautiful. I kept seeing people out there boating, and I really wanted to do that. But I didn't want to start down here. I thought, well, I'll make this a longer day, and we will start at what's called White Bridge. So I got my husband and my intern, and we got some boats, and we got in the water under the bridge, and the water was like this deep, and the boats were floating fine, and it was going great, and we got down around the corner, and we hit the first riffle. The water was like that deep, and so this was maybe a problem, and this is probably where we should have turned around and paddled back up. But I wanted to know what was going to happen if we kept going. And my husband wasn't really realizing what was going to happen if we kept going, and the intern was just trying to be a very good intern. And so we kept paddling. And then we started carrying our boats, and there became less and less water. And 3 hours later, we were on the first adventure of the Verde walkabout experience. And I had been stung by a bee. We had seen 2 rattlesnakes. My husband wanted a divorce, and my intern was sure she had the wrong job. And so we kept going because there was nowhere to get out. And so we got to the end of the reach, and all of a sudden we got to this place where it looked like this. And there was a waterfall coming off the bank and into the river. There was about 20 CFS that day coming off the side of this cliff and coming back to the river. And I thought, well, there is something wrong. We just went through this whole stretch where if I was a fish, I would not have been able to swim. If I was a kayaker, it was a very terrible experience. And if I was a farmer, clearly there was something I could be doing better. And so I got out some data. It was time to do a little bit of science. And this is a graph of the flows in the Verde River. So on this axis, this is cubic feet per second, and this is for June of 2007. Down here are river miles. So this is the top of the Verde Valley, so 52 miles. This is the bottom of the Verde Valley. And what you see is there's 70 CFS at the top of the valley. It comes, gets diverted, water comes back in, it gets diverted, water comes back in. All of it gets diverted, water comes back in. We get to Oak Creek. Think about Sedona, big red rocks. How beautiful is that? A lot of that water gets diverted, but a little bit gets left in Oak Creek and makes it to the Verde. Brings the flows back up. It gets diverted, gets brought back in, it gets diverted, gets dumped back in. It all gets diverted. Some of it makes it back. And this is where I put my boat in the water. And you can see that that's less than 10 CFS most of the way. And then at the very end there, you see it comes back up. And then we go down to the end of the valley, and it's a gaining stretch. So what I essentially boated, what took me almost 4.5 hours, was from here to there that we carried our boats. And so I thought, well, there's really a problem. There's really something we can do about this. There's clearly not an issue so much with consumptive use of water in this particular stretch. It's about how we're using water. So we started thinking about, well, what would we want, and how would we get that? So we identified some flow targets, and this is a long process to get to flow targets. We actually were asked by the Walton Family Foundation, who's our primary funder, what our flow targets were, and I said, we don't have the science for that. And so they hired a consultant, and the consultant asked me about 20 times, and I said, we don't have any numbers for that. And they said, we're funding you, and we'd like to have a number for this. And so I said, well, that's cool, how about 20? And so we had flow targets. And then they hired another consultant about 2 years later, so last year, and he said, well, I think your 20 is because you're not trying hard enough. And I said, well, I think my 20 was because I had no clue what was going on when the first consultant asked me. And so he said, how about 50? And I said, how about 30? And he said, okay. And so we now have flow targets very scientifically established. You see why I can't cite papers. 20 CFS for the Upper Verde Valley, because we do recognize that we want to keep land in production, and we value that as part of the community, but we also recognize that this irrigation company, along with these 2 here, and some work by the municipality in that area, we could reasonably achieve a target of 20 CFS. So our targets are not based on what is the best breeding for humpback chub or roundtail. It really is based on what can we expect in the river and have a reasonable partnership with the community. And very similar, in this stretch, we know what projects we need to do to get to that target. We just have to figure out how to fund them. Our other target, I will mention really quick, it's an important one, is maintaining flow at the gauges. So there's a gauge here, and there's a gauge here. So our goal is not to let flows at that gauge drop down to that 30. It's to keep the average flows there, which means we need to do something about mitigating the impact of the groundwater pumping that's already occurred, and we need to manage future groundwater pumping as well. So those things are really important. We're going to talk a lot about surface water, but recognizing that groundwater is a very important component of this system, as it is in all systems in Arizona in particular. If you do not know how an irrigation ditch works, this is one example. Most irrigation systems that I'm familiar with in the West, they are kind of spread out. You take water, you move it far away from the river, you use up every drop of water you can on those big, beautiful expanses of land. However, in the Verde, we're in a confined system, so you actually can't get the water very far from the river. And as a result, we have 5,582 acres of irrigated land in the Verde Valley. If you go in one valley in Colorado, you can find farms that have that much irrigation on just one farm. So this is not a huge system, even though ecologically it's very important in the Colorado. It has some very unique habitat, 13 native fish call the Verde home. So while it may not be as agriculturally important as some areas, it's ecologically very important. And we have a very good chance at saving it and restoring flows to a high enough condition. So what happens in our systems, and many like them, you have a diversion dam in the river. It diverts water. It runs along a main line. There's laterals taking water out. The laterals spread water on farm fields. And then oftentimes the laterals are open and they run back to the river and create return flows between the dam and the final return. You have subsurface flow coming off the fields and back into the river. You have ET coming out in the trees. You have houses. So, you know, this is something that's somewhat unique to the Verde, but not completely, is that we have a lot of irrigation on residential properties. And so one of the things that we really struggle with in the Verde is these guys have rights to irrigate. They were never taken off the land, and yet they're small residential uses. They're watering, 1 or 2 acres. And that really creates a conflict between small users and the few large farmers, because a small irrigator takes, 2 hours, maybe 3 hours to run water across their irrigated field. And that's to irrigate 1 acre. Whereas a large farmer is going to need probably a 12-hour set to irrigate his 100-acre patch. And that water may not be available when he needs it. So a lot of the work that we've done has been to identify these areas where we have trouble with the large irrigator and how do we address some of their concerns. This is really an example of the lowest cost system. You can see this drawing has no structures. And that's actually pretty similar to what many of our ditches in the Verde looked like. They didn't have head gates because head gates got flooded out, so why would you invest in one? This is a very natural system. We don't have regulating dams up this high, so everything floods. And so if there's head gates, they're often up here, where they're far away from the river, where they're not going to get flooded. So these were really low-cost systems. These people don't take the time and the money to invest in their systems. And so what we really started to identify is the reason that they were taking 45 CFS out of the river and returning 20 is that's how they had done it, because it was the easiest, the lowest cost. And so we really wanted a way to address that problem. How do we help them instead of creating a conflict? And so these are just some tools that we're using. So we don't have one-size-fits-all answer in the Verde, and we don't have one-size-fits-all in the Colorado Basin. So we have transaction-based tools, which are essentially, we will pay you to do what you need to be doing or what we want you to be doing. We have full season and partial season fallowing programs. Typically, I'm not a big fan of fallowing because then you have the land issue to deal with. I came from a very small nonprofit, and as a small nonprofit, we would look at the Nature Conservancy and go, they just take land out of production. And now working for the Nature Conservancy, I go, ooh, I don't want to be that kind of TNC. So we really are trying to look at how do we do something alternative to full season fallowing. And that's something we're working on, and the Verde is actually summer fallowing. Ooh, I only have 5 minutes left and a lot of slides. So what we're working on are these summer fallowing, so that we don't use water in June, but we're irrigating the rest of the year, so we can irrigate crops in January and actually get production off of the fields. So trying to identify something that works for the area. So we're going to go away from tools. We're going to talk really quick about one specific project. And this is probably the best example of the work that we have done. And this is very consistent with what we're doing with all of the ditches. So this is the Diamond S ditch. This is the ditch I tried to float through. I found their return flows. I called the ditch manager and I said, there's a waterfall at the end of your ditch. And it was really a problem for me when I went kayaking on Saturday. And he said, who are you and why do I care? And I said, well, I'm Kim, and I'm this great person, and I'd love to come out and meet you, and hey, maybe we could, talk about this. And he said, you kind of sound like a communist, so I don't think I'm going to talk to you. But I'm really persistent, and it turns out I'm much more of a capitalist. And after many conversations, I asked Frank to show me how he regulates flow in his ditch. And Frank generously obliged by jumping up and down on a blade that had a bar above it and nearly dying. And I said, Frank, this is not safe. You seem like a really cool guy, even though you still hate me, but I don't want you to die. So we're not going to talk about changing the flows in your ditch anymore until we figure out a better solution. So we installed some measurement equipment, and we learned that they were wasting a lot of water. They learned that they were wasting a lot of water, and it was rather embarrassing to them. They regulated at 30 CFS because they couldn't get enough water in their first lateral below that, and they regulated at 45 CFS because they flooded their neighbor. That was how their whole system worked. And so we said, well, there's probably a better way. And they said, well, there's probably a better way, but we have no money. And I said, well, I have money. It comes from the Waltons. And they said, Walmart? Walmart wants to buy me something? I've given so much money to Walmart, it would be nice to get something back. And so we bought them automated head gates. It turns out automated head gates solved a lot of their problems. And that got us to our first year of the pilot agreement, because it's nice to buy people infrastructure, but you actually have to pay them to use it. Otherwise, it sits out there and looks really shiny. So we provided an incentive payment the first year if they would regulate their flow to an average of 25 CFS. Their consumptive demand on that ditch is about 8. So we were not asking for a stretch here. This was really achievable. And they got to the end, and they felt so successful. And they said, we want to do more, we want to do better, but we need more money. And it was true. They have a lot of infrastructure problems. This ditch hasn't been maintained since 1902. It was built in 1864. About 1902, it seemed like it was working good enough, and we stopped. And then around 1990, the NRCS provided more infrastructure that they didn't know how to use and actually made their water problems worse. Sorry, NRCS, but it was a communication problem. They did not know how to use the gate they were given. And so we actually said, here's how you're going to use it, here's what we're going to pay you to do. We've now entered into a 3-year agreement with them where they will earn money over the next 3 years to improve their infrastructure further. The ultimate outcome of that, we hope, is a finalized, restored gate so that the gate can just take the amount of water that they need. Instead of being a system where 45 CFS is acceptable, this will be a system where it works at under 20 CFS, and they'll have the infrastructure in place. So they'll have the capital to do that. We'll work in partnership with them to create that long-lasting change. What's really important in Arizona, and I will not go much farther, is we don't have water laws that really facilitate us doing anything permanently legally. So we have to make do with physical changes that result in what we want to see. So that's why we're doing that. So we're not going to go too much more into this. We have a lot of other projects. We have a really awesome farmers. We try to find financial incentives that work for them that are not outrageous. I don't want to price myself out of the market. Sometimes I feel like I'm giving them way too much money for Camp Verde standards, and then I look around the West and see what other people are paying, and I go, oh, I'm getting this cheap. Our Diamond S deal, as a reference, we pay $10 an acre foot for that water. By the end of the 3-year agreement, we'll only be paying $6 an acre foot. So, we are trying to make this something that is a long-term program. We have a lot of awesome funders. Bonneville Environmental Foundation has been an amazing funder for this work. And I am out of time, I'm getting the eye. So just to give you really quickly, this program has been going for the last 4 years. We've restored 10 CFS in the river. We have partnerships with 8 irrigation companies, and we've invested more than $175,000 in the ground. This is happening all around the Colorado, and the Nature Conservancy is very proud of its role in the pulse flow efforts, our San Pedro recharge network, and work with the water system, which I think Dan will talk more about some of those other partnerships. So I will end there.